The ceasefire between Turkey and Syrian Kurds expired earlier today, but was quickly replaced by a new agreement brokered by Vladimir Putin, not the United States. Now the fragile truce will continue. And as Nick Schifrin reports, raising the question, where does this leave the U.S. and its Kurdish partners?
With cameras flashing, Syria's top two power brokers met to discuss and divide northeast Syria. In the Russian resort of Sochi, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan sat down with host Russian President Vladimir Putin. After a 6-hour meeting, Erdogan said Turkey, Russia, and the Syrian regime together would evict Kurdish fighters known as the YPG.
YPG terrorists and their arms will be taken further than 30 kilometers from the border. Their fortifications and positions will be destroyed. Turkish and Russian joint patrols will begin.
That is not what the U.S. expected. Last week, the U.S. and Turkey negotiated a buffer zone 18 miles deep and 75 miles wide, where Turkish forces in blue entered and Kurdish forces retreated. And this is the area Turkey and Russia agreed to, the Syrian-Turkish border all the way to Iraq and the strategically important towns of Manbij and Tal Rifat, an expanse of more than 300 miles across. And after 6 days, the Turks and Russians promised joint patrols indefinitely within 6 miles of the border. Russian forces have backed and saved Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime. Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin called the agreement a permanent solution.
In my opinion, these decisions are very important, maybe even momentous, and will allow to resolve the situation.
But today, Russian ally Assad met with his forces in Idlib, the final rebel stronghold. He called the agreement an illegal annexation.
Erdogan is a thief who stole the factories, stole wheat, stole oil in collaboration with ISIS, and now he is stealing the land.
The U.S. also objects. Today, the administration's point man on Syria, Ambassador James Jeffrey, told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee the Russian-Turkish agreement increased instability.
In the process has scrambled the entire Northeast, undercut our efforts against ISIS, and brought in the Russians and the Syrian regime forces in a way that is really tragic for everybody involved.
The administration has promised to impose new sanctions on Turkey. Jeffrey did not follow through on those threats and instead called the Russian military paper tigers.
The ability to patrol with the Russians 10 kilometers deep and a potentially not particularly believable Russian commitment to get the YPG out of that area. So Turkey has not really gained all that much from this.
But it's not clear the U.S. can do anything about it. U.S. troops crossing from Syria into Iraq were dubbed traitors by Kurds who up until last week called them partners. Today, the Pentagon said U.S. troops would move to Iraq to fight ISIS. But Iraq said those troops don't have permission to stay in the country. U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper promised not to keep them there forever.
The aim isn't to stay in Iraq interminably. The aim is to pour soldiers out and eventually get them back home.
Today, the White House authorized $4.5 million to help the group known as the White Helmets, who try to protect civilians from Assad and Russian bombs. But while millions have already fled the regime, nearly 200,000 more civilians have now fled the Turkish incursion. Some have already left for Iraq. Others, like this group in eastern Syria, wait to cross the border.
The future is gone. We left our future. I left and came here just so we can save these children.
But it's too late to save many Kurdish forces who fought against ISIS and were killed by Turkish-backed troops. In total, more than 700 have been killed.
And Nick joins me now here and with us from northern Iraq, special correspondent Jane Ferguson. She's on assignment there near the Syrian-Iraqi border. So Jane, tell us, you've been talking to people there. How are people who live in that area affected by all these changes?
As we heard there, Judy, from Nick's piece, up to 200,000 people have already fled that area. And what we're likely to see going forward is a great deal more people fleeing. There's huge uncertainty. Now, if this deal does bring an end to the fighting, that's only one facet for Kurds living in that area. They will be very afraid of the prospect of seeing within a week Turkish forces across the border, although that won't be as deep across the border as Erdogan initially wanted, the full 20 miles. Those 6 miles are still host to many Kurdish families. It's still part of the Kurdish heartland. So we're likely to see more people fleeing, both within Syria, being internally displaced, but also across the border here in Iraq. We've seen families arriving every day, and they're not just fleeing the fighting, they're fleeing the prospect of a potential Turkish occupation of their homelands.
And Nick, what do these changes mean for the United States, the things that the U.S. is focused on, including those ISIS prisoners who were being held by Kurdish fighters?
Yeah, 10,000 ISIS prisoners, according to the U.S., are being held by Kurdish fighters. And for the first time today, we saw a senior U.S. official, Jim Jeffrey, who we saw in that piece, admit that, in his words, dozens, not hundreds, dozens of ISIS fighters have been released. Now, the Syrian Observatory, who tracks pretty much everything that happens in Syria, says that 800 ISIS family members have already been released. And Jeffrey admitted that he has no way, the U.S. has no way to track any of the ISIS fighters that have been released. He expressed confidence that the Kurds who are still guarding these prisons would still continue to do so. But he said that some of the prisons are inside the new Turkish-Russian safe zone. And he said he did not know what was going to happen to those prisons. And it's just a good reminder that ISIS remains a threat. The Pentagon itself, the Inspector General just a few months ago, said there were 18,000 ISIS members across Syria and Iraq, and in Syria still establishing resurgent cells, basically trying to become an insurgency again.
And separately from this, and Jane, back to that news conference today with Turkey's President Erdogan and Vladimir Putin of Russia. You were listening to that along with us, and you were telling us you were hearing some of the finer points that were being made. What were you focused on?
What was interesting, Judy, wasn't just what was said, but what wasn't said. Now, Erdogan has had extremely strong language in recent days, talking about cracking skulls of the terrorists. But what we heard of today was this push to get YPG, or the Kurdish fighters, out of the 20-mile buffer zone. He was very specific about saying fighters. Now, he wasn't specifically saying Kurdish civilians. That's likely in response to a huge amount of concern and global concern and fear over ethnic cleansing of those areas, over a potential plan by Erdogan to sort of de-Kurdish the area, so to speak, because in the background, you know, the context to all of this and this buffer zone and pushing these Kurdish fighters out is Erdogan's plan that he's talked about openly to resettle several million Syrian refugees, most of whom are Arab, in those areas, in what is the Kurdish heartland. So that has caused massive concern about whether or not that would clarify or qualify as ethnic cleansing. Now, by saying that they want the Kurdish fighters out, they haven't really clarified what would happen to their families, the communities that they come from that live in those areas. They haven't talked about having any kind of peace deal or any kind of deal for the Kurdish fighters to put down their weapons. Instead, they've said they just want them to leave that entire area. Where that leaves the many, many other Kurdish families and civilians who are related to these fighters is not clear at this stage. And there's still a concern that there could be a huge ethnic shift in that area as a result of the organization of this deal and how it pans out in the coming months.
And it's so important, Nick, because as Jane is saying, the Turks are saying we're only concerned about the Kurdish fighters, but some are interpreting that as they're being opposed to all people of Kurdish heritage. But Nick, what I finally want to ask you about is how the map is changing. The U.S. believed it had an understanding with Turkey about how far Turkey was going to go into northern Syria. Now it appears the Turks may be going farther. What is the U.S. reaction going to be? The
Russian-Turkish safe zone is 4 times the size of the U.S.-Turkish safe zone. And today, Kurdish fighters and Kurdish leaders said that the Turks were attacking them outside the agreed-upon U.S.-Turkish safe zone. So both of those are abrogations of the deal that Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo agreed with President Erdogan last week in Ankara. And the U.S. has vowed to sanction Turkey if Turkey acted beyond that deal. This morning, just a few hours before Jim Jeffrey testified, a senior administration official reiterated that to me and a few other reporters, saying if the Turks violate our agreement, we no longer have an agreement to lift our sanctions and freeze our sanctions. So there is a U.S. threat on the table that was made before the Russia-Turkey deal was announced, and we will see if the U.S. follows that up. Meanwhile, on the ground, Assad has more control over territory today. The Turkish gains have been cemented, and of course, Russia has more influence diplomatically, and it's not clear the U.S. can do anything about it.
Although they will say that we've had this understanding, it's not clear, as you say, where they go.
It is up to the U.S. to follow through on its threat to punish Turkey for this, and we'll see if they actually follow through on that threat.
And it's not only Russia winning here diplomatically, if you will, it's the Russian military. Jane, there along the border between Syria and Iraq, you were telling us as soon as the U.S. troops leave, it's the Russian troops coming in.
It's been a remarkable turnaround, Judy, in just about a couple of weeks since we've seen the announcement from President Trump that the U.S. troops would be pulling out, to now seeing Russian troops, not just Vladimir Putin negotiating this deal in Sochi, but yes, Russian troops will soon be patrolling the entire border area, up and down, all the way here to the Iraqi border. And it's been a massive turnaround. It can't be stressed enough how much of a reversal that is. We've, of course, seen images of Russian troops entering into hastily evacuated American bases along that border. And now we'll see Russian boots along the ground, along the entire stretch of it. It really solidifies that military presence along an extremely strategically important area of the Middle East that cuts between Iraq and Lebanon. And we'll see Russian boots on the ground there potentially indefinitely. There's been no mention of when they would leave, if ever.
Jane Ferguson reporting from the Iraqi side of the Iraq-Syria border. Nick Schifrin here with me in Washington. Thank you both.
Thanks very much.